In the northeast of Houston, in the Katy area, the inner suburb of Houston, which included a rather upscale suburban housing neighborhood which stretched towards the state highway of 249, which included a semi-commercial and residential area, had come under heavy People's Armed Police assault conducted by two different battalions from the 36th PAP Brigade, which was a standard People's Armed Police brigade. However, the forces were heavily equipped with anti-tank weapons, primarily the HJ-08 anti-tank missile, along with also the lighter and extremely highly produced, nearly ubiquitous Type 69 rocket-propelled grenades, which had the anti-armor round as well as the anti-personnel round for groups of infantry. And the anti-armor round was highly effective against most light armored vehicles and definitely against soft-skin vehicles, and had a high success rate against vehicles like the American M113 and also MRAPs. However, it had a more difficult time with the Bradley and the M1 Abrams tanks, which were actually relatively decent armored vehicles. And the 3rd Squadron, its Hotel, India, Kilo, and Lima companies came under this heavy barrage of hunter-killer anti-tank teams firing their weaponry, along with their air support coming from dedicated Wing Loom 2 combat drones firing their CM502KGs or HJ-10s as well, which both were highly potent and decently ranged anti-armor missiles, with the CM502KG in particular having a very high penetration rate, being also a dual-purpose missile utilized against ships as well. As the loitering munitions, which were also roughly as ubiquitous as the Type 69 rocket-propelled grenades, being the infamous CH-901As, which had the choice of a heat warhead, an HE warhead, or a fragmentation warhead, were equipped with the heat warheads and were utilized to devastating effect in support of the PAP ground forces, along with the Wing Loom 2-based missile strikes. And also, another potent weapon that the PAP had brought to bear was their highly mobile WZ-551 infantry fighting vehicle with its very strong 25mm autocannon, able to penetrate almost any armored vehicle minus a scant few, including the Abrams, but it could tear a Bradley to pieces with its HE armor-piercing ammunition. And this wheeled vehicle had, for a military vehicle, a relatively high rate of speed and equipped many of the PAP's forces, minus a handful of their medium brigades and their very few heavy forces as well. But the highly trained and motivated Praetorian Guard-like forces of the CCP regime, being the People's Armed Police, were similar in many ways to other very well-armed paramilitary forces of other nations, both in present times and in past, and resembled in some ways the Waffen-SS in terms of their capabilities and their motivation for the party. And they had smashed the 3rd Squadron of the 278th Armored Cavalry Regiment and had thus cleared the flanks for the movement of another of their battalions, which was already moving straight down 249 and into the inner city after having done its part in clearing the outer flanks of armed reactionary civilians caught emerging from their homes through China's enormous ISR network, which included everything from their squad-level quadcopter reconnaissance assets, and typically paramilitary forces in China usually had them at the platoon level, but there were times when they would be deployed at the squad level in the paramilitary elements like the People's Armed Police, and the 36th PAP was one of those forces. And also the high-altitude WZ-8 stealth high-altitude drones, the CH-4A high-altitude armed reconnaissance drones, and even higher-altitude assets such as China's many military satellites, as it actually had the most military satellites of any nation on Earth. And although not in commercial until they had swatted all of America's down, were already catching up in that category as well. As the People's Armed Police was clearing the flanks in preparation for other operations within their sector, The PLA's relatively large formation, the 83rd PLA Group Army, had its forces engaged all throughout the city against the rest of American military forces present. One such force was the Hickory Squadron, as it was called, or essentially the Regimental Support Squadron of the 278th ACR, which, as it was true enough that the Ellington Field, or Joint Base Ellington, was to become the primary logistical hub for the area, there were forward logistical points, and two major ones. One ran by the HHC, or the HHT, the Headquarters of Headquarters Troop, over the entire regiment, which was in the south central Houston area, just south of the Buffalo Bayou tributary, which also ran through a different area where there was an inland port that used to handle barges and now was a convenient location for a supply depot, as supplies could be moved in by sea, also rail, and by road into this area, as the port had long since been shut down due to security concerns, as it was a difficult area to patrol back in the early 2000s, and now had been requisitioned by the state and federal regime for logistical operations as a forward logistical point for the 278th ACR in the city. As the defense of Houston operation from a logistical standpoint was actually brilliant in how certain places had been utilized and leased, including the area held by the Hickory Squadron, which most of it was present, minus its Charlie troop, which was its medical troop, which was distributed amongst all the other combat elements of the 278th. Its Alpha and Bravo company, as well as Foxtrot Company, and even its Headquarters of Headquarters, were all present in eastern Houston in the Galena Park area, which had at one time a burgeoning steel industry, but the steel mills had all been shuttered. And oddly enough, not only had one been rented out and leased for use for the forward logistical point, along with a lumber yard, which had been requisitioned for the placing of tents in the same area, along with the inland port nearby for the reception of logistics by sea, by barge, but also the CCP had purchased another closed steel mill just across town from the one used by the Americans, and had placed one of its entire mechanized infantry battalions within it in terms of all of their vehicles and supplies, which this mechanized infantry battalion being one within the 58th Combined Arms Brigade of the several within that Combined Arms Brigade, and it too had been basically emergent from its steel mill owned by the CCP and was now headed for the Americans in their location, as the PLA's mechanized infantry forces were equipped with the standard Type 89A tracked armor personnel carrier with its W-85 heavy machine gun for the turret, as well as its now state-of-the-art, state-of-the-industry, highly advanced VN-20 infantry fighting vehicle, which the ZBDO-4A was already an exceptional infantry fighting vehicle, but through the active duty PLA forces had been gradually replaced by the brand new and even more capable VN-20. And these were now the standard infantry fighting vehicle that equipped the armored infantry of the tank or armored companies, and also the mechanized infantry companies in each of their platoon had one, and the combat engineers as well. These were now the standard. And these forces, along with their fire support company, which came equipped with the self-propelled dual assault gun mortars, which are 120mm PLL-05s, which were very powerful and could fire as direct fire as an assault gun, or they could fire arced fire as a very heavy mortar system, as well as also two firing platoons of their light artillery multiple launch 130mm rockets, their Type 63 systems, of which their fire support company had two of those as their firing platoons and one PLL-05 firing platoon, and offered their infantry a very highly mobile and devastating form of fire support. And they would also be supported by local artillery forces, which were already firing at their various targets within the first 45 minutes, all throughout the city, along with the strategic air raids and also even tactical air strikes in some instances in some areas. Although the fighter aircraft, and there were quite a few of them in this particular battle, as their numbers as a grand total were 48 when including the 12 FH-97As that shadowed their J-20 stealth fighters of the J-20 squadron of the PLAAF committed to this battle, now could carry their air-to-ground munitions in limited capacities as they were primarily armed with air-to-air munitions, but all combined they carried enough between them that they could conduct tactical airstrikes or close air support operations if the troops called for it. However, usually this was unnecessary as there were also 20 Wing-Loong 2 dedicated combat drones assigned to just the Houston battle, along with even the CH-4As, of which there were 3, and although they were not attack drones and they were high-altitude recon drones, they were armed with actually more hardpoints for weapons than even were the Wing-Loong 2s. They could carry 4 extra air-to-ground weapons, and even those could be called in if absolutely needed by the troops in the field. The fighting over the area in question, where Hickory Squadron was in the East Houston metro area in a place called Galena Park, which had at one time, again, a steel industry, also its petrochemical industry due to the refineries and other plants, and also the chemical industry in general in Houston, as Houston had a very well spread out industrial base throughout all different parts of its city. As it had developed over time, the zoning in different areas had encouraged economic growth for a time, and the city had boomed as a result with multiple different industrial parks and zones spread throughout it. And Galena Park was no exception. Although the steel industry had suffered and its inland port had suffered, it was being reinvigorated in other ways. As the mechanized infantry battalion attacking the area was attacking the Hickory Squadron, or most of it, minus much of its medical troop or its Charlie troop, a group of 250 armed reactionary civilians had emerged from their neighborhoods with arms in hand, and all had been spotted by the high-altitude and low-altitude quadcopter reconnaissance aircraft, which were the ISR constellation that China mapped the battlefield with in real time, as did Russia and their other allies, and fed into the AI systems, which processed and compiled various dimensions of data to assist the troops in performing in the field at a far more efficient rate than was ever even before possible by any army ever in history. And China and Russia had these technologies and used them to great effect. As the mechanized infantry battalion from the 58th was attacking into the area, it was now 12:45 when the battle began and a line of contact developed. As Interstate 10, which was absolutely vital in this operation and was perhaps the defining objective of the entire battle, as again the Trojans were fighting over control of key transportation nodes that would be required for their external components to race deep inland and get to where they needed to go as heavy-handed reinforcements. And Houston was a major node as it pertained to operations in the southeast of the United States. As I-10, when the group armies 15 through 20 completed their operations in the lower Rio battle at the McAllen area, they would proceed to I-10 in the Houston area and race deep into the country's southeast before fanning out to assist the other Trojan shock armies that were further inland and highly dependent upon their arrival on the scene. And the 83rd PLA Group Army was relied upon to get the job done and achieve the objectives of capturing Houston and I-10 intact. The other highways were relatively important as well, but nowhere near as much as Interstate 10. And I-10 was literally only a kilometer away from the segment of the battle which was occurring as the forces began to clash along a line of contact in the area. The Buffalo Bayou waterway that ran through this area used to accommodate barges that would sail to this inland port that was right here, just in and off the map where the barges could offload their cargo. There was a steel mill right here that was now being utilized as a major forward logistical hub along with the inland port off of the Buffalo Bayou Waterway, which flowed all the way through downtown, if continuing further inland off and upstream toward the west. This steel mill here had been shuttered but had now been leased from the property brokerage firm and was now being utilized as a major supply hub, as a forward supply depot, operated and controlled by the 278th ACR's Hickory Squadron, which its Alpha and Bravo were present in this area, although when the artillery barrage began at midnight, along with sea-based cruise missile fire coming in at the time of this map by 12:45 after the coastal operations were already well underway, the cruise missile fire shifted inland to support the operations going on therein. And two YJ-18B submarine-launched cruise missiles were fired at the different targets, including the steel mill and the lumber yard, where a lot of tents had been set up for the troops to billet in that belonged to this particular squadron, who would work at the inland port facilities here and also at the steel mill in stockpiling supplies for the defensive operation of Houston. As again, America had no idea what was coming. They just assumed that hostilities rising to the level they were at, coupled with the Sino-Russian naval drills off of both coasts, put them on a high state of alert, and they were only now slowly beginning to mobilize, as they had not even fully mobilized all their Guard and Reserve forces, with some states achieving a higher rate than did others. But in this particular area, the line of contact had developed as the CCP forces, the PLA troops of the Mechanized Infantry Battalion from the 58th Combined Arms Brigade, supported by the heavy artillery fire coming from the Artillery Battalion from the 113th Combined Arms Brigade, whose area of operations was just neighboring and to the south, were heavily supporting their actions by shelling the inland port facilities that were being utilized by the logistical forces. And also there was a mortar platoon present and being billeted in this area that belonged to the 2nd of the 156th, a Mechanized Infantry Battalion, which was part of the 256th Infantry Brigade Combat Team, which also itself was a part of the much larger 36th Infantry Division of Texas. But the 2nd of the 156th was an out-of-state element brought in through the Ellington Field with its equipment trained in by train to assist in the defense of Houston as a major key city for the United States, as its fourth largest city and one of its biggest industrial cities by far. And as the mortar platoon with its M113 mortar tracks with 81 millimeter mortars had safely for a short time moved out of the area as the buildings were beginning to be mercilessly shelled, at the first sign of trouble had evacuated the buildings, and as there was a flood park plain all along the waterways, similar to that in Dallas along the Trinity River, which was a dual-purpose park/levee dike spillway area for when the river flooded, these terrain features would be utilized heavily in this battle by the ground troops to take cover behind and within, as the terrain here had various drainage features and ditches and elevation changes and mounds, and also areas where there were thick tree cover to hide amid for the troops, although it wouldn't help with China's superior ISR assets able to see everything the Americans were doing, where the opposite was true for the Americans, and they could see hardly anything that the Chinese were doing, as they had lost all their ISR capabilities and even their GPS, which much of their weapons accuracy relied upon. However, their mortars would score some lucky shots before they themselves were rapidly destroyed in turn by counter-mortar fire and loitering munition strikes from HE warhead-equipped CH-901As, as it was decided for this particular battle, as the headquarters company, or rather the headquarters battalion of the 113th Combined Arms Brigade was closer to this action than was the headquarters battalion of the 58th, which was nearly outside of the core metro area. It was determined that not only would the artillery battalion of the 113th support the troops of the mechanized infantry battalion from the 58th Combined Arms Brigade, but also so would the headquarters battalion's dedicated drone section firing their TEL-based system with their 48-tube CH-901A system to support the troops in their combat in capturing this section of I-10 and also simultaneously eliminating the Hickory Squadron, which was one of the primary forward supply forces for the entire defense forces in the Houston area, as also its headquarters of headquarters troop or company over the entire regiment was based in just to the south of downtown, and it too was another of the major forward supply forces that, when supplies arrived in Ellington, could be distributed to them and then further distributed out to the combat forces in the field. And striking and eliminating these two forward and also command elements, as the entire command elements and administrative forces of the 278th were also contained within this force, within the headquarters of headquarters troop, eliminating their logistical and headquarters elements was a prime priority for the PLA's 83rd Group Army operating in this particular battle. Ellington, too, was the first major action to occur inland, as the beach landings were occurring in Texas City, Texas, with the very short-lived naval combat, as well as the American Naval and Coast Guard assets were completely annihilated early on in the battle. By now, 45 minutes in, as the PLA troops had moved from their steel mill from within which the CCP had purchased and placed all of their trucked-in logistics for this battalion and equipment, the troops that had mustered there and had gotten into their vehicles and did their pre-maintenance services and checks and armed up and made sure they were green on ammo, fuel, food, and everything, and water, and their vehicles ran smoothly, had now advanced and clashed with the Americans, who had hastily emerged from the lumberyard, steel mill, and riverine port facilities that were now being heavily hit by 155 shells at the opening of this very map. At the opening of the map, there's a lot of activity occurring in this one segment. There's 4 total companies on the PLA side present, as their mechanized infantry battalions were set up with their headquarters and support company, their fire support company, which was all present, their PLL-05 platoon of the self-propelled dual-purpose assault guns / mortars that were 120 millimeter, their PLL-05s, their Type 63 multiple launch rocket systems, their 130 millimeter systems, which were easy and quick to reload, and they had a range of 5 miles, while the PLL-05s had a range of 5.5 miles. And they combined could rain down heavy destruction on their enemies. This was their headquarters platoon here of the fire support company outside of this apartment complex. This was in a residential area on this side of the river, where you had apartment complexes and a gas station and small businesses. On this side, it was a residential area as well, with housing neighborhoods and small businesses, a gas station. And on this side was the industrial area of the Galena Park area. This was the inland port, which had docking facilities just off the map, literally right here, with the port facilities, which were being slammed by artillery strikes at the opening of this map. The mortar platoon had gotten safely out for a time, and at the opening they had tried to fire their mortars back because people were running and fleeing the area as the PLA approached. Although this bridge had been hit by a Fab 500 strike to separate the Americans from each other while this line of contact developed so that they couldn't reinforce one another or send supplies back and forth, as the different companies became mixed up with one another, and mixed squads were even common, as the chaos of the artillery strikes, lacking communications from the loss of satellites, and also their cyber attack, which completely removed the military networks, and with the anti-satellite strikes, which removed GPS, satellite-based data transfers and communications, and everything, and as well as the Kabini systems as the EW systems in the area, jamming redundant communications like radio. They had no way to communicate except through hand signals, line of sight, and earshot. And as a result, and their weapons suffered in terms of accuracy. They had to walk their mortars in, and were able to fire some very lucky shots aiming for the bridge, as they could at least do that much. And they hit and eliminated one full PLA squad that had gotten into cover early on by this bridge as they were attempting to recon this area, as well as send their ISR assets over to thoroughly monitor all the activities going on. And by this point, the loitering munitions and ISR assets were covering the area of all these different squads moving in. There was a company in this area and off map to the south and east here. There was a company in the middle here, basically right here. This is a whole company. And then there was a company moving in over here. And to the north off map, there were 6 total mechanized infantry companies, the fire support company right here, and of course, the headquarters company off map with the command elements of the battalion and more logistical forces. As there were also Wingloom 2s in this battle, as again, 20 Wingloom 2s were dedicated to this battle space. They were earmarked just for the Houston battle. Like there were 5 at Houston, there were 20 here. Were participating as well, with 2 flying in and firing CM502 KGs at 2 MRAPs, destroying them, these Max Pro MRAPs with 50 cals mounted, with the heaviest American vehicle being their M113 APCs, due to the fact that these were support forces, although they had armored logistical vehicles, as they were part of a CAV unit, and they had to be able to be relatively protected when supplying their combat forces. These vehicles could not stand up to the HE warhead-equipped loitering munitions, which were a balance between the capabilities of the fragmentation warhead and the heat warhead, which was ideal for heavily armored vehicles like IFVs and tanks and others. But the HE could destroy an MRAP or an M113, and also these M113 mortar tracks with their 81 millimeter mortars. And although they had wiped out a full PLA squad with 4 mortar strikes by this bridge, they, in turn, were hit by counter-mortar fire from the 120 millimeter mortars fired from the PLL-05s, along with 4 different strikes coming in at the same time from loitering munitions with HE warheads equipped, which also wiped out the troops around the vehicles as well. This artillery strike on these port facilities, 130 millimeter rocket strikes hitting them as well off map, as 1 platoon of rockets was firing this way here, and the other was firing and vectoring fire over here by the lumber yard, which was being hit heavily by 130 rockets and 155 millimeter strikes. The steel mill was completely annihilated, which was being used as the main logistic dump, as logistics could be brought in by water, by barge, to the inland port up the river here, up the Buffalo Bayou River. And this was a big area too, where they would be stockpiled from the river and then brought by truck, by LMTV, or by their armored vehicles to build up supplies in the steel mill. And the lumber yard was where they had their tents for their billeting for their troops. This facility here that hadn't been completely destroyed was where their battalion headquarters, or troop headquarters, a headquarters company of their troop, or their headquarters troop of their battalion, had moved into this small warehouse facility right here to try to weather out what was going on with the precision strikes hitting their lumber yard, steel mill, and their port facility, inland port facilities that were just right here and slightly off map, being heavily hit and destroyed. As the mortar platoon had been completely wiped out, again, it came from one of the out-of-state forces from the 2nd of the 156th, which was from Louisiana. It was part of the 256th Infantry Brigade combat team. This platoon had been billeted in this area due to the decision to send them to be a supporting element for the logistical forces, as it was desired to have some kind of combat troops with them should the worst occur. And although these were not combat troops by any means, they would fight tooth and nail to try to prevent the PLA troops from crossing and seizing control over this area, as again, this area was of vital strategic importance, not only because it was a major forward supply dump for the Americans, but also for the entire defense of the city, one of two major ones, but also because it was adjacent to I-10, which was literally right off the map north of the lumber yard. And that area was being captured by this company, another company off map, this company, and another off map was capturing this area over here off map, crossing the river there. And of course, there was this company here, one more behind it, and the headquarters and the fire support company, all 8 companies. And up here where the terrain by the road was elevated on elevated terrain, and then the terrain went gradually down into a ditch and a berm by the water, as this was a sort of levee system to prevent flooding. And this was a sort of park-like area with trees and plants and overgrown grass. And the troops were using these as positions to fight from, as fighting positions. A squad went down and bounded in here and got in a line formation, firing over at these forces. These machine gun-equipped armor personnel carriers were firing their 50 cals back. There were a few with Mark 19s that fired back, but the PLA troops were firing with their infantry fighting vehicles. Elite IFV here firing its 100mm main gun at these troops and vehicles, which were highly devastating, along with the 30mm autocannon, which would shred infantry to pieces and tear up later armored vehicles, even heavier ones like the Bradley. It would shred a Bradley into a can with holes in it. And the armor-piercing HE ammunition was the most devastating on vehicles, but there was also normal HE ammo and also armor-piercing ammunition, like miniature Sabo rounds. And the 100mm main gun itself was a highly devastating weapon from the VN-20, and also it had its HJ-12E anti-tank missiles, which were also utilized to destroy the vehicles, but they could have been used on troops as well, but these were very destructive and they had a decent range. And this vehicle in the end got destroyed at the opening of the map by fire coming from the troops. They had their rocket-propelled grenades, their Type 69s. They were heavily laden down with those. They also had HJ-08 man-portable anti-tank missiles, which they also fired at the vehicles and enemy troops. They had the anti-personnel or anti-armor rockets for their Type 69s. They had their 35mm grenades from beneath the rifles of some of the men who carried those tubes. They also had their general purpose machine guns in the form of the Type 67s, and they also had their QBJ 201 squad automatic weapon type machine guns, which had an extremely high rate of fire with their 5.8 by 42mm rounds, which had a slightly better performance in ballistic terms than did even the 5.56, but the squad automatic weapons, the M16A4s, some troops that carried the one-shot recoilless 84mm shells known as the AT-4s, which are actually pretty good weapons, were using them in return, as well as also 40mm grenades from their 203s beneath some of their rifles, and the exchange of fire was savage. This actual battle would go on for an hour and a half, the fighting here. Although the PLA forces had overwhelming firepower, the Americans fought for dear life because they literally were fighting for their life at this point. As the cruise missiles came in and hit the steel mill even after the artillery had already razed it to the ground, and also hit the port facilities after those had already been destroyed, with a lot of troops already caught up in the artillery barrage, as seen right here, already wiped out in the opening, with many more beneath the blast icons as shown. 130mm rocket strikes hitting just down this street by these other port facilities, with the actual port infrastructure just off the map right here. And the lumberyard up here was taking a pounding, and again, this place had already been wiped out, with these troops right here wiped out at the opening because they were within very close proximity to the artillery strikes. And as these vehicles, these cargo vehicles, were moving through the area, these LMTVs, full of logistics, full of supplies, a mortar had struck. ISR-directed mortar strikes were coming in all over the place. One had landed right here and destroyed this fuel truck and KIA'd these troops and badly gutted this building right here, this office-type building in this warehouse center here, and damaged the armored recovery vehicle, with other mortars being fired and destroying this APC right here with this half squad behind it, and 2 more mortar strikes destroying this APC with its half squad behind it, with the vehicles of this platoon having come around the bend while they were earlier taking fire from across the river. You can see the contact was made, and then they got to the bridge and stopped and laid down fire on these forces as they temporarily held at the bridge. While that happened, multiple things were going on all at the same time in this battle. Fire was coming from between this apartment complex as this platoon of 5 vehicles led by their IFV, their VN-20, rolled through this little garden area to the end of the street, firing their very powerful weaponry across the river at these forces on the other side, including their 12.7 millimeter machine gun fire coming from the Type 89A armor personnel carrier gunners and the gun turrets, with the troops firing their HJ-08s, their small arms, and their 38 millimeter or 35 millimeter grenades and their Type 69 RPGs at these troops over here, while these troops returned fire with their AT-4s and M249 saws and their other weapons and 50 cals from the vehicles. But the firepower from the IFVs were too overwhelming, and were beginning to gradually cut these troops down, even though they were behind relatively good cover of berms and mounds and ditches. These troops, too, were getting into the ditch, and they went and formed a line formation here. Troops in the next tier up, like a terrace, like terraced firing, where there's terracing, where this squad coming around the apartment block got here, laid down in the prone, while this squad was already laying down covering fire so they could come in behind them and bound into position, while this other squad off map bounds down in here and gets in positions, laying down fire on these forces on and off map, with vehicle-based fire giving them covering fire to support their ability to move in place, including these troops along this curb right here on the elevated street, firing over at these forces while they're returning fire. These troops were trying to reinforce the fighting going on at the line of contact, with this vehicle moving up and getting hit by IFV fire. A 100 millimeter shell annihilates this thing, while these guys bounded and covered this double column formation bounded here, and then they bounded here, and then by the time they bounded here, they were taking so much fire they decided to go and turn to bound away from this area, but they had all been cut down by the heavy hail of fire coming in from this direction here, while this squad had been wiped out by the time they got to the end of the street with this vehicle. The IFV fire and 12.7 fire, along with all the other fire, was just too much. They all got cut down as this vehicle was destroyed at the opening by an HJ-08 anti-tank missile fired from one of the troops, as there were a lot of troops dismounted in the area to provide mutual support with their vehicles. As that was happening, this platoon from this company was moving in through this area, and this dismounted squad of their platoon's troops with other squads in the vehicles had bounded alongside of them, and they were fighting from the bridge while these vehicles were moving up to counterattack along with this squad behind this fence right here, as this was a neighborhood. There was a squad behind a fence that peeled out from behind to support their vehicles in a counterattack, a local counterattack, to stop them from crossing the bridge. While that was going on, these forces alongside this building right here, this office-type building, had moved into this area, taking fire along with these guys also still taking fire, but the vehicles blocked a lot of the fire from the dismounts that moved up beside them, taking position, and they had destroyed all 4 of these vehicles, with the loitering munition strikes hitting and destroying these vehicles and troops back here as they had HE warheads. They destroyed a few of the vehicles and KIA'd the troops that were around them. It was highly destructive, with mortar strikes happening right here, here, here. These troops were all KIA'd at the opening of the map. This vehicle and troops were KIA'd at the opening of the map. These guys were exchanging fire as this squad moved in to replace this squad as it bounded and covered with this squad. This squad moved ahead in the wedge, lined up in a line formation. Then they bounded ahead and lined up in a line while they were laying supporting fire with the vehicle-based supporting fire coming in. The assault gun mortars even moved up to be able to provide direct fire over into this area here and slam into these areas that were already highly rubbled and shelled, just in case enemy forces might try to take position in the rubble in some kind of way, although it would have been basically asking for like a death wish because artillery was still pounding this area mercilessly, as cruise missiles also came in and hit the remaining rubble of the steel mill and made a large crater, and also hit the lumber yard again after all the artillery had hit it. As that had happened, the artillery began to calm down as the troops were preparing to cross. And as this platoon had come around the bend and stopped and laid down heavy fire over into this area here, along with the support coming from the dismounts that moved into this ditch right here and took position and laid down fire, along with this culvert drainage area right here that ran down and gradually got lower until it dipped into the river here. These troops moved in alongside of that and took position in this ditch that connected to the drainage ditch right here. They came in, stopped, and laid down fire, and then they moved in again and then stopped and laid down fire. CM-502 KGs flew in too and destroyed these troops, causing these troops to retreat, but they were mowed down by the troops or by the vehicles that made it around the bend and opened fire on them. As all of that happened, there was the Tu-22M heavy strategic bomber moving over this area. Now, it had targets of its own that it was already to hit very early on in this battle, and it was not going to participate in the fighting here, as it had strategic targets it had to hit involving American defense industries and offices that were specifically tailored into the war plan for this individual bomber to strike. Although some of the bomber squadron would be used in a tactical capacity, that would not be the case in this particular engagement. As in any instance, the supporting fire coming from the fire support company right here by this apartment complex, right here too, their assault gun mortars, the fire coming from the 130 millimeter rockets and 120 millimeter mortars was already substantial, as was the drone-based missile strikes coming from the Wing-Loon 2s that were participating, the two of them that both fired CM-502 KGs and destroyed this MRAP and this MRAP and wiped these troops out right away and caused these troops to retreat only to get intercepted and wiped out as they did. These troops right here tried to hold the line in the rubble, but the direct fire coming from the IFV-based fire was too much and destroyed them. And as all of this was happening, as these troops had bounded from this city block right here, this apartment complex, and moved right here behind this mound, as this one had bounded then into this ditch and took cover in the ditch and was laying down fire into this area right here, they were laying down heavy fire to support the vehicle crossings of the different platoons moving into the area to breach the line of contact. This dismounted squad in a wedge formation, as this squad was already in position, as earlier before the map opens up, they'd already bounded right here and took cover behind this mound and tree lines. This squad then bounds and takes cover by the bridge, gets in a line formation by the embankment, and uses that to fire on these forces here, while these guys are laying down fire against them too to support their vehicles who are laying down fire as well. Mutually supporting fire, all on the same targets, vectored fire, all being advised by ISR assets and the artificial intelligence network processing all the combat data, advising all the different forces how to coordinate their fires, including from their infantry fighting vehicles, from the 100 millimeter guns, the 30 millimeter autocannons, the HJ-12E anti-tank missiles, that each platoon has one of these, vectoring their 12.7 millimeter heavy machine gun fire, even their individual troops using their anti-tank weapons and their rocket-propelled grenades. All of it, including with the fire support company being coordinated together, along with the air power involved with the drones and the Russian VVS fighters if needed. They were doing combat air patrols over this area to ensure air superiority because it was still very early on in the invasion, and that was standard operating procedure. However, if needed, they could have been diverted to do ground strikes, as they did still carry some limited air-to-ground munitions, whether that was their S-25 rockets or some Fab 500s that they carried. They did carry some air-to-ground munitions, but they would only be utilized for close air support if absolutely necessary. In lieu of that, the drones were typically the most relied upon for the troops on the ground in this instance, until they would do an RTB and refit with almost entirely air-to-ground munitions. As these forces were destroyed early on, that went America's last hope in this battle for having any type of fire support of its own. As early on, at the very opening, they did get some good shots and they wiped out a PLA squad. They had 8 KIAs among the PLA there, but were hit by loitering munitions, as the loitering munition was a weapon that offered deep strike capabilities to the invasion forces, as they could go deep behind the line of contact and strike American forces that were further back, like these headquarters and logistical elements here, as there are a lot of mixed forces at this point. Because of the artillery fire driving the forces into different groupings due to lack of communications, they could not effectively coordinate or organize, and they often got mixed up into different groupings of troops. With these supply vehicles all being annihilated by mortar fire and strikes from loitering munitions, they were packed full of supplies that were direly needed by the troops. These armored M113s, too, were filled with supplies, but they would get intercepted and destroyed as the PLA troops of this platoon from this other company, off map partly, moved across the river as they had eliminated these forces that clung on for dear life fighting the PLA and trying to prevent them from making their crossing. But the forces of the dismounts opening fire, along with the vehicle-based fires, completely annihilated them, as well as mortar strikes and also the rocket strikes happening slightly on and off the map at the port facility, along with the heavy artillery strikes, which destroyed a lot of vehicles and troops, as many had literally disappeared and were essentially vaporized in the lumberyard, the steel mill, the port, and left very little left for the drone strikes, the loitering munition strikes too, which hit these supply vehicles at the opening and destroyed them, full of supplies, to take out. So even though it took time for them to get across and fight through these forces, even the counterattacking troops here, as well as also troops doing a tactical retreat that bounded around this building and would end up fighting these troops as they got across, with this wedge formation squad making it across, taking position here to guard the flanks while their vehicles moved up and were firing further off the map at other forces, including these armed reactionary civilians on the other side of this house, when dismounting their squads to provide mutual support. They had wiped out the troops that had retreated after the mortar strike KIA'd about half their squad. The other half of the squad retreated here, paused for a bit, and then went here. And when the PLA vehicles came through, they opened heavy fire with their 12.7 millimeter machine guns, 30 millimeter autocannon fire, 100 millimeter main gun fire into this area, and just annihilated these vehicles. This last surviving vehicle that didn't get destroyed by the artillery strikes at the opening, that hit this area of small businesses here because there were enemy troops around it. At the time the bridge had been eliminated, they had troops over here, and they were all hit by a savage artillery strike, and the vehicle, this LMTV, was destroyed. All these dismounted troops in a double column formation here, these two squads were KIA'd, these dismounts from these supply vehicles, these armored M113 supply vehicles, these were all destroyed except this one that went over here. But when the missile strike came and destroyed these, this vehicle was destroyed in turn by the ground-based fires coming from the vehicles and troops over here that destroyed it because it was still on the street and could be seen, and it was hit by 100 millimeter autocannon fire. And as the forces here had the other half squad retreated here, they were destroyed by the vehicle-based fire, and the dismounted troops got out and fought these armed civilians. And these armed civilians that were in this small business parking lot here had bounded around here and tried to help the half squad fight these guys that came across, but they had been parried and destroyed by the heavy hail of 12.7 millimeter machine gun fire from the vehicles, as well as a 30 millimeter fire just shredded these troops up, in 100 millimeter. And then they reoriented their fire and watched down the street. There were other crossings occurring at other street bridges further off the map in both directions. But by the time this platoon had got through the line of contact, it stopped its vehicles here and opened fire on the surviving vehicles with the 100 millimeter and 30 millimeter cannons and destroyed them with the 7.62 millimeter coax on the VN-20 firing at any troops they saw. With these troops hiding around the corners, The mortar fire destroyed these forces in this building here, but there were troops hiding around the corners here. And the dismounted troops began to bound and cover tactically together, as you can see by these small arrows around the buildings and rubble, as the artillery had been lifted so that these forces could move safely through the area. The other two squads bounded and covered here, with one squad going in to clear this building, this warehouse building, with two squads going around this way and two going this way to pincer the building, which destroyed these last vehicles with rocket-propelled grenade fire and also with HJ-08 fire. They annihilated these vehicles, but the vehicles fired back and managed to KIA a few of the PLA troops. But they got this MRAP as it went around the corner, as these loitering munitions earlier had taken these vehicles out. It scared the MRAP driver who drove to this corner and then was ambushed as these troops bounded and covered into position and fired an anti-tank missile and destroyed it, an HJ-08. And there were some forces when they went in to clear these buildings that had surrendered, but they had KIA'd most of this headquarters element. These were the headquarters forces over the entire battalion, as they had decided not to use artillery against them and tried to capture their commander alive, as they wanted him as a high-value POW, hence the reason they didn't just utilize artillery and missiles as they fled the lumberyard and into this facility. That was the reasoning given. So as they had closed in and captured this area, more forces crossed to the north and secured Interstate 10. The main objective of this battle is this is only the main segment of the larger battle, because there's more going on this way to the southeast and also to the northwest of this particular segment. This is only a 1 mile north to south by 1.5 mile east to west area that encompassed a residential/commercial area, a residential and small business area, and an industrial type area here. And the PLA troops of the Mechanized Infantry Battalion had then thereby secured the area as this platoon had crossed here and secured the area of the industrial park portion to the south. As the vehicles moved here, they dismounted all 5 of their dismounted squads, and the vehicles then continued on this direction and secured in a line this segment by this street here where the bridge had been destroyed near the now horribly destroyed inland port facilities, the riverine port facilities of the Galena Park area. And as the squads secured this area, they early on had fired at some of these troops over here and wiped them out as they had crossed here. Again, this happened at the same time this was going on here, so it has to be understood. And as they got into some contact and a short firefight, they eliminated enemies in this area. These two squads holding their position here while the vehicles moved on. And these squads had gone around this gatehouse here to this industrial area and had moved into the area here and fired on these forces here. They outflanked them basically while this force moved to the gatehouse and went to the corner and opened fire. That allowed for this force to stop here, fire, and then bound over here quickly and then take position on the rubble and fire. And while they did that, this third squad came around here by the mound and was taking position on the mound, firing down at them in the prone from that way. So they got all those guys, essentially, and then they held their positions here along with their vehicles and secured this entire area tactically. As that happened, this MRAP had already been destroyed by the heavy artillery fire. The entire squadron by this point had virtually been all annihilated, and the rest of it that was off map in this area and a little bit to the south, they had all been wiped out by this point as the forces had crossed and completely penetrated the line of contact and secured the areas behind it after first slicing through it and seizing the command elements over the entire squadron, as the artillery barrage that opens up this map had already KIA'd a fair number of the American forces of the Hickory Squadron, as many of them were busy at the time working and stockpiling logistics in the inland port area, the steel mill, and there were plenty that were moving around in the lumber yard trying to set up more tents and other portable buildings. And when the artillery fire had opened up, it was completely unexpected because all the communications had been removed. Satellite-based everything, internet-based everything, and redundant radios were all gone due to electronic warfare jamming, which caused panic and confusion and troops moving in different directions, moving out of certain areas as they were about to be hit, which saved them for a time, but then they were struck by the fire support company firing their 120 millimeter mortars, also the loitering munitions fired from the headquarters battalion from the other combined arms brigade of the 113th, whose artillery, which was their PLZ-05s, their 155 millimeter, and headquarters battalion's drone section was supporting the mechanized infantry battalion that was coming into this area to secure I-10 and kill two birds with one stone by eliminating the massive forward supply area that was being set up by Hickory Squadron, or the Regimental Support Squadron, in other words, of the 278th ACR. The only other major one that was also under attack this early on at the same time was the headquarters of headquarters troop, who was actually getting hit with tactical ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and artillery fire, and would even have a Tu-22M completely carpet munition the area they were within, and only one small factor would save them. That will be gone over in a future video. But at this time, the area being secured had essentially led to the preparation for the next battle that would have been conducted by this very same battalion after a short rest and replenishment period after this victory, after defeating the American logistical forces of the 278th ACR, as they would then drive deeper into the downtown area and assist the People's Armed Police Forces, as well as other PLA assets, with securing what would become the future Red Zone. However, this was already a major step in the battle at Houston. In the next installment of this series, as PLA forces were on the move everywhere, as the Trojans emerged from CCP regime properties and began going for all of their different objectives, primarily destroying the American military where it stood in the city, as well as securing key areas within the city and destroying others. The forces of the artillery, two battalions that had gathered, were about to be engaged by two PLA tank or armored battalions, essentially, coming in from the 131st Heavy Combined Arms Brigade, equipped with their state-of-the-art, state-of-the-industry Type 99As and their QN506 tank-busting brand-new vehicles that also doubled against infantry forces as superb weapons of war. And now that they had cleared the flanks of armed reactionary civilians, along with heavy support from their artillery battalion, were moving in quietly against the American artillery, which had already ascertained the location, thanks to civilian refugees and armed civilians fleeing the area, of these two support battalions belonging to the 83rd Support and Sustainment Brigade, and were trying to fire on them without the aid of modern navigation, as well as modern methods of targeting, as their FDCs had nothing of which to rely upon other than maps and using artillery the old way, and using scouts to ascertain positioning and doing the math and figuring out the calculations of the powder and shell combinations with the fuses. And now they would be attacked head on by very powerful maneuver elements, as two full armored battalions were coming to annihilate them and remove one other chess piece from the battlefield, as again, this battle in this area here had lasted an hour and a half. This battle here would have been even shorter, and that will be explored in the next video installment of this hypothetical fourth generation warfare invasion documentary series, highlighting fourth generation warfare doctrines using real factors